Before we get going with Deprogrammed today, I'd just like to remind you that the New Culture Forum is hosting a conference on the 7th of October on immigration, what many regard as the most important issue facing this country. If you're concerned, which you should be, make sure to sign up and come along. It's very reasonably priced. 7th of October this month at the Emmanuel Centre. On with the show. My name's Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm thrilled to be joined today, as ever, by Evan Riggs, who is a freelance journalist, and our special guest this week, video comment editor at the Telegraph, Steven Edginton. And in fact, Steven, it may interest you to know that you're the first guest we've had on Deprogrammed for a second time. But I think it was rather inevitable in the circumstances, given the reporting blitz that you've currently been on at the Telegraph, revealing even more levels of wokery in the civil service than you usually report on. What have they been up to this time?
I'm deeply honoured to come back. Correct.
Quite right.
And I think, I'm glad you have me back on because I have a lot to say.
Indeed.
Yes, I've been reporting on civil service wokeism. This has been an interest of mine for 4 years now. And at the weekend, I did a big report in the Telegraph. Saturday, Sunday and Monday, we had reports out discussing all sorts of examples of wokery, gender ideology on race, pushing Black Lives Matter, pushing transgenderism across more than half a dozen departments. And we highlighted some of those examples, and we kind of stitched together an overall kind of package, if you like, of what we call woke Whitehall. And this culminated in a letter that was sent to Simon Case, who's the Cabinet Secretary, head of the Civil Service, in April, from 42 different civil servants from 16 departments, saying that they have serious concerns about a breach of impartiality in the civil service because what they see as gender ideology is being pushed in official emails, in official documents, in official meetings.
I see.
So, Steve, maybe just for our viewers, in case they haven't read these 3 articles, which I highly recommend doing so, could you just run us through the 3 main sort of incidences that you covered over the past few days?
Yeah, I think we covered many more than 3, but I can focus on 3 if you like.
Sure. The headline ones in each case.
Yeah, I can give you some examples. So I'll give one example is Bromley Healthcare. It's sort of it's not the right word. I'm trying to think of the way to describe it. Bromley Healthcare is a sort of firm in South London that provides community care across South East London. It's not actually technically part of the NHS, but it receives majority of its funding from the NHS. They are hosting a diversity conference in October, a 3-day diversity conference where they're discussing pronouns and gender identities and all of these things. So the accusation is that they are wasting time when actually, according to a source inside Bromley Healthcare, many of their teams are in near crisis mode. In other words, they might be shut down because of short staff issues. And other examples, in the Ministry of Justice, they released a newsletter last year. One of the civil service gender networks claimed that a belief in 2 genders is a product of colonialism and white supremacy. They said in the MOD, you actually had a huge rebellion against BLM, and in the summer of 2020, senior MOD officials hosted a Zoom call with lots of MOD staff where they were talking about the BLM riots, and lots of MOD staff were saying, actually, we should be focusing on our proud military history. Why are we supporting a neo-Marxist organization? Actually, several people described BLM as a Marxist organization. So that's one example where civil servants were fighting back. In terms of other examples, in DEFRA, civil servants were shown a training video where there was kind of these weird, terribly acted out scenarios. And one of those scenarios featured a transgender woman, basically a bloke in a wig, trying to get into a female-only toilet, and this woman said to him, "You can't come in," and he continued to kind of try and push past her, and she said, "What are you, some kind of pervert or something?" And this training video describes that as inappropriate behaviour, and it was in a section on sort of discrimination.
On whose end?
Yes.
The bloke in the wig or the woman who's barring the door?
Of course, the woman. The woman was meant to let him in.
Be more accommodating.
Be more inclusive.
Be more inclusive and accommodating. Okay, so and was there a third one you wanted to mention? The Bromley Healthcare.
I can tell you about lots more in the Department for Business and Trade.
Sure.
There were internal messages supporting Black Lives Matter. They said that their press office had launched initiatives to educate people about white privilege. They also said one of the Department for Business and Trade civil service diversity networks put out a statement on their intranet saying that white people can never be discriminated against because of the colour of their skin. In the Department for Work and Pensions, civil servants released documents internally in discussions around what was meant to be on universal credit about a parent's guide to Black Lives Matter, with a section on why it's dangerous to say that your child isn't a racist. There was another document that was released called 30 Days of Pride, which featured more than 6 hours of LGBT educational videos on things like pangenderism, asexuality, transgender children. So we covered lots and lots and lots of examples from, I think, 9 different departments of wokery.
So has the woke left officially gone mad?
Listen, we've got to describe this for our Telegraph readers. This is woke madness. This is sort of, it's all gone bonkers.
It does seem like a step too far
crazy.
to me, yeah.
I know that sounds like, you know, to people who are online, right-wingers, like very sort of normie, as that's the language people use, isn't it? But I think, you know, you have to explain these things.
Sure.
Many people don't know what's going on internally. And this is the crucial thing I'd say is, you know, civil servants try and cover this up, and this is some of the other reporting I did.
This struck me as what was slightly different, because you say you've done a lot of reporting on this. I think it's widely known that the civil service is biased in this direction in many cases. But what struck me as A, encouraging, and B, concerning is the first, that there seems to be more resistance in the civil service to much of this stuff than I would have expected to be the case. But B, that comes with a culture of bullying and intimidation, which intimidates those people into not speaking out in the way that we might want them to.
Yeah.
Would you say that those are 2 new aspects of the story, and could you elaborate on how relevant you think those 2 details are?
Yeah, well, I think there's 500,000 civil servants, so one would hope that at least a couple
Be able to find 5.
don't agree with what's going on in Whitehall. I think the majority, to be honest, my impression is that the majority of civil servants disagree with the stuff, but quietly they can't say anything because they feel that they'd be intimidated by their bosses, or they don't know what the response of their bosses would be. Obviously, some civil servants are very active within these diversity groups within Whitehall who are pushing this radical ideology on transgenderism and on race. So it's very difficult if you're a civil servant and you disagree with this stuff. You don't know what the response is going to be if you start sort of blowing the whistle and talking to your bosses and complaining and things like this. And also, all the incentives within Whitehall are to push the diversity agenda. If you want to get ahead in your career, it's far better to sign up to the non-binary network, because that shows that you're participating in the diversity and inclusion agenda, which is part of your corporate objectives in many cases. So civil servants are actually judged in their work objectives on how inclusive and diverse they are being. And they're encouraged to sign up to these networks, these groups. They're encouraged to attend the events. They're encouraged to do all of these things. And just remember, this week is National Inclusion Week.
Oh, I hadn't forgotten.
If you're a civil servant, you would never forget this, because there have been so many events internally within various different departments that I've been sent, which are all discussing diversity, transgenderism, race, all of the topics, their favourite hobby horses this week. So that's just one example of like complete waste of time. And it seems like every month and every week there is some sort of Inclusion Week or Black History Month or Gay Pride thing or like Transgenderism Day of Visibility, blah, blah, blah.
It's taken on a liturgical character, so to speak, in that it is the calendar is infused with the significance of all this sort of
Canada
religious
went from
trappery.
Pride Week to Pride Month to now Pride Season.
Well, we have that.
Pride Season.
We have Pride Season, and the reason I know about that is because it's written in civil service documents and in civil service emails and in civil service intranet. But this is the interesting thing. Go back to your question. Civil servants rebelling against this stuff. Okay, so 42, as I said, 42 civil servants from 16 different departments wrote to the Cabinet Secretary in April complaining about this stuff, complaining about an atmosphere of fear of being victimised for holding their gender-critical beliefs, right? Now, this is seriously important and actually quite unprecedented. The fact that they wrote this letter to the Cabinet Secretary is a serious matter. It's very, very rare that that would happen. And the fact that this letter got leaked, to me, is even rarer, that something like this would become public. But it shows that the anger is there, so much so that this letter has now become, we published this letter. And as I said, in the MOD, there were people fighting back, and there are lots and lots of civil servants who do disagree with this stuff. They set up a network, a civil service group, a civil service diversity network last October called SEEN, which is a network specifically for gender critical staff. So these are people who believe that there are two biological sexes that you can't change. And because gender critical beliefs are protected under the Equality Act against discrimination, they're allowed to set up this network because of the Maya Forster case. So you can see civil servants are organising, beginning to organise, and to try and rebel against this stuff. Unfortunately, they face huge issues. One of the things we reported at the weekend was bullying, widespread bullying of gender-critical staff in the Ministry of Justice. In a call in March earlier this year, civil servants from various different diversity networks met to discuss issues like diversity, and on this call, gender-critical civil servants were compared to Nazis and were told that they want to destroy the LGBT community.
Yes.
So, we reported on widespread bullying, and we looked at different surveys of gender-critical civil servants where it said that I think 40% of female staff said they'd been bullied for holding gender-critical beliefs, 30% of male staff said the same thing. So there was a huge issue in the civil service. We've highlighted loads of those stories, but there is also a backlash.
Do you have any idea what the reception inside Whitehall has been to your reporting?
I do, that's a very good question. So after every story that I do, I always ask the civil servants that I know, what is the reaction internally? And almost always it is, we're going to double down, we're not going to be intimidated by the right-wing press, we're going to continue our diversity initiatives, this is only going to get more diverse, more inclusive. We're only going to go even further because the bigots on the outside, they don't understand what we're doing. So unfortunately, yes, this week I have had feedback internally from various departments where their bosses and things like that, they haven't said, oh, well, maybe this is something we need to look into, maybe this is political, maybe we need to look at some of the criticism, maybe some of the stuff they're saying is fair, maybe civil servants in the NHS shouldn't be spending time talking about pronouns instead of helping patients. Maybe that would be a bad thing, but instead, actually, we've seen the complete opposite, and it's very unfortunate. And this is the other thing we reported, sorry, just to finish this point.
Sure.
After these stories, civil servants are so angry that their internal blogs, their internal communications discussing diversity are becoming public to the people that they serve, to the taxpayers that they serve. They're so upset that this has happened. They have launched leak investigations into these stories.
Wow.
So they're actually trying to go after the people who are exposing what would seem like very kind of innocuous. In one sense, it's not classified information. This isn't like highly sensitive stuff. This is literally the civil servants discussing pronouns and diversity. And I know of several examples, and I've reported on this in the last few days, of where different departments have launched leak investigations into my stories. And just to give you one example, last, I think, November, the Treasury launched a leak investigation and threatened, quote, disciplinary procedures against a civil servant who leaked from, again, I'm quoting exactly from the email, an internal blog on Black History Month. Sorry, you're threatening to either sack someone or whatever because they shared a blog about Black History Month. I mean, if civil servants are so terrified of their communications on Black History Month and diversity becoming public, my response to that would be maybe you shouldn't be publishing these things in the first place.
Yes, well, it goes to show as well that there is this culture of widespread entitlement within the civil service. It seems to me, again, from your reporting and the reporting of other people, that they don't really regard themselves as public servants there to serve the public interest, there to serve the people. They regard themselves as mandarins in a position of power to remold and reshape the attitudes of people throughout the country. And therefore, whenever these things do get released, because it goes against the democratic ethos of our time, that these people are there to serve the people, they should be accountable, rather than, as you say, changing tact or adopting a new course, they double down on the wokery.
What you have to think of from the perspective of a woke civil servant is this. What is my priority as a public servant? Is it to deliver on the priorities of the government? No. Is it to deliver the best patient healthcare I can deliver? Is it to make the service the most efficient and cost-effective service possible, let's say in the Home Office? Is it to stop immigration? Is it to do all these things? Or is it to make the civil service the most inclusive employer in the UK? It's the second one.
Yeah,
it's the latter.
Advance in the bureaucracy.
They literally say their objective is to make the civil service the most inclusive employer in the UK. When a civil servant asked a permanent secretary in the Department for Business and Trade, or what was the Department for International Trade, what is your #1 priority? They replied, to make the department the most inclusive department in Whitehall, not to, let's say, get a trade deal with India or whatever.
There's a really wonderful remark by, it actually happens to be one of my colleagues, Anthony Daniels, but he also sometimes goes as Theodore Dalrymple as his pseudonym, when he says that increasingly public servants, talking about civil servants, people on councils generally, they want to change human nature, but they don't want to collect the bins. Like this is the sort of the new mentality of these mandarins.
I mean, it sounds like kind of a facetious question, but what do they even mean by that? Like, we want to make this the most inclusive employer. Like, inclusive to who? They just want to continue hiring, you know, down the like sort of international or intersectional stack of like woke liturgy. Like, what does that even mean ultimately?
This is just my view, but I think that all diversity and inclusion initiatives are a zero-sum game aimed at disadvantaging white men. And I think that is what they mean. They mean we want to help every group, every minority group, promote them, employ them, help them in any way we can by hosting events, by hosting training, by supporting them in their career through mentor schemes and things like that. Help all of those groups who aren't white men. And I think that that's what all of this ultimately comes down to. It's about the fact that white men have original sin. We are the baddies. We are the ones who oppressed all of these people before. We hold white privilege. We're the ones who have had so many systemic advantages throughout the past. And now they see it as their purpose to correct that injustice, that social injustice, and to support minority groups who have been oppressed historically.
Right. But if you include everybody who's not a white man, essentially what you're doing is just excluding white dudes. I mean, that's the de facto sort of outcome for this. I mean, on the topic of diversity too, it seems so strange to me that this would be, you know, the kind of the raison d'etre of any sort of government institution, given that Britain, you know, I mean, you would think that the demographics of Whitehall, whatever, would kind of closely match the country. But there's no talk about Britain's sort of indigenous diversity at all, or actually like a diversity of political beliefs. So it seems to be more of a de facto institution of like ideological homogeneity. And these people are not very shy about this at all. So my question to you, Steven, is last time you were on the show, I said that we should just basically start shutting down government departments and just turning people's key cards off. And you were like, well, I don't know if we should go that far. Do you think that Whitehall can be reformed and kind of pulled back from this sort of aberration in what you might call its telos, right? It's kind of founding principles. Or do you think that we're just going to have to shut it down and kind of reboot it, restart it?
I think that it requires huge changes in law in order to impact what's going on in Whitehall. So you have to repeal the Equality Act or heavily amend it. You have to end what's called the public sector equality duty.
Yeah.
You have
and it should be said as well, that was, I believe, was imposed by the Conservatives in 2017. That's not even a Labour initiative, is it?
Yes, that's right. And the Equality Act itself was amended by the Conservatives. It could have been repealed. I mean, it was a Harriet Harman initiative originally, passed by the Brown government. Conservatives have had every opportunity to repeal it. Instead, they've amended it and made it worse.
Yeah.
So you've got to get rid of those laws which are justifying all of these diversity initiatives within the civil service. You also have to ban every single civil service diversity network and group who are a huge part of pushing these woke ideas. You also have to send out diktats from the Cabinet Office. One SPAD said to me, this is a quote we included in one of the articles, every week Rishi should be issuing diktats and statements from the Cabinet Office to every department saying you mustn't talk about transgenderism in this way. You must be impartial. You must shut down XYZ event or whatever, because a lot of this stuff comes from the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office is the head of the civil service. It's the thing that basically regulates all the civil service. So should we start shutting down the Home Office? Well, maybe. I'm not like an expert on Home Office, on how the Home Office should be structured, but if you're specifically looking at shutting down these official woke ideas, I've just given you a few examples of what you can do, and it's fairly easy if you've got the political will and if you've got the members of Parliament who are willing to take those steps. Sure. But they're not. So,
I think
so it's not going to happen.
I could get the figures slightly wrong here, but the point will be made nevertheless. I think in 1920, in the British Raj, a civil service composed of roughly 12,000 people. Roughly 12,000 people presided over a population of 300 million Indians. It's not clear to me why we need 500,000 of these people in Whitehall.
Yeah, it's so funny. You can go back even further than that, and I think it was like they had like 1,000 people ruling India at one point. And even that they saw as too many.
Yeah.
The thing is, you don't need all these people. That half of them are just sort of middle managers, and why are there so many? Also, why are there so many people specifically working on diversity and inclusion? That's something that is so easy to.
But I think this partly has to do with the Conservative change in the law in 2017, because before the Equality Act was worded reasonably vaguely, I suppose you could say, whereas in 2017 the Conservatives under Theresa May, who recently admitted that she is woke, by the way, which is interesting, in 2017 her government rather imposed a public duty on all. A duty on all public bodies to publish measurable equity objectives every year.
That's right.
And since between 2015 and 2021, DEI roles across Britain have gone up by 71%, and I think legislation like that is partly responsible, because obviously if you're a civil service department and all of a sudden you've got these public duties being imposed on you to publish measurable equity objectives, you need people to crunch the numbers, you need people to write reports, to work this stuff out, and they're going to need salaries. And I think there was a reasonably recent, I think, where are we now? So about 9 months ago, there was a Conservative Way Forward report, which you probably read, which documents the incredible amount of savings we could make in the public purse just by cutting all of this divisive nonsense from the public sector. Savings totaling around 7 billion could be made just by getting rid of funding woke charities.
That's right,
or whatever it might be.
What they do internally is they publish these equality impact assessments, and you look at something like HS2, they've spent so much taxpayer money on specifically looking into how HS2 can support diversity and inclusion, and that is, supporting black companies that they're contracting out to, etc. And this is only going to get worse under the Labour's Race Equality Act, which will also say specifically that companies can, choose, or government contracts can go specifically to black-owned businesses, which is completely wrong from every kind of moral, legal perspective, I think, in this terrible situation. So if you think it's bad now, understand where it's going to get worse. Civil servants will feel that they're emboldened to talk about this stuff more out in the open. I think at the moment there is this kind of weird situation where civil servants know that what they're doing to an extent is wrong, and they disagree with government policy. They know that certain ministers, like people like Suella Braverman, are kind of against this stuff, and they're sort of doing it on the down low. But when Starmer comes in, I suspect that this will become endemic even more than it already is, and we will be reading stories every single day about what's going on in the civil service.
And executive and civil service will be as one in a way that it's not completely comfortable at the moment. But one of the reasons why
it is to a big extent,
which is why I want to say
make that point.
Absolutely, I really want to make this point, because there is a risk of people reading your reports and thinking, gosh, maybe this Conservative government isn't so bad after all. They're just being thwarted by these ideologues, and they're oblivious to it, and maybe they could do it. But it's important to point out that the Conservatives have, they have at best enabled and at worst facilitated this kind of stuff within their midst for the most part.
If Rishi didn't want this going on, it would be over by Monday.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, it reminds me a lot of Chris Rufo's reporting on critical race theory in America, where he came out with this reporting, very similar to what you've just done on Whitehall. And like 3 or 4 days later, Donald Trump signed an executive order, and he was like, no more critical race theory in federal government. That was it. It was over. I mean, Joe Biden then repealed it, but I imagine it'll come back. My question for you, Steve, is that you just said when Keir Starmer gets in, so you see that as an inevitability now. You think the Tories are going to get wiped out. Do you think that that is actually kind of the best possible option, because it will get so bad that someone will then have to kind of galvanize a new political force in opposition to all this madness? Like, we just have to go through a kind of, winter of despair before somebody can come through and clean up a little bit?
I already feel in despair. Yeah, I think to a certain extent, maybe you're right. It could go the other way. They could think, oh, well, Labour got this big landslide, so what we need to do is just become more Labour. And that's what the Conservatives did after Blair came in. So
David Gauke will step into the void and say, what we need is sort of sensible right-wing centrism. And David Gauke and Rory Stewart.
Yeah, because the Tory party is far right, of course.
Of course,
and, you've got the Suella speech and etc. So, no, but that's one possibility. But the other problem is, I think, with that line of argument, is that Labour will make constitutional changes which will be so difficult to unpick that I'm not welcoming a Labour government in any way for that reason. And I think it'll be hard for any Conservative party, any kind of Conservative party that keeps and maintains its ties and connections with the left of that party. There'll be no way that organisation would undo any of Labour's major reforms. And just to give you one example, the recent example...
You mean its new reforms were to get in?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So recently Labour are saying, and George Osborne agrees with this, that the OBR should have a lot more power over government budgets and sort of deciding what should go in a budget. And you have to consult the OBR before you're able to make these important changes. And he's saying that, and they're saying that in response to obviously Liz Truss's budget last year. Now, the OBR was an organisation, again, created by the Conservatives. Unfortunately, it is part of that economic orthodoxy that believes in the same kind of policies that we've had in Britain for the last 20, 30 years in terms of economic policy. And whether you agree with those policies or not, it is not within sort of the democratic framework to allow an unelected quango to have so much power over economic policy, because ultimately who are they accountable to? And I think there are so many of these organisations that Labour set up under Blair, Climate Change Committee being a great example, where they have no accountability to voters, where these are independent bodies, where Labour say, quite cleverly, oh, well, this issue is far too contentious to talk about politically, and we must have the sensible adults agreeing on this policy, and therefore we must give all of the authority and power over to this organisation. Oh, by the way, don't forget, don't think about this part. Oh, it agrees with everything we say, and will always be there, and is impossible to remove.
But they also happen to be dispassionate experts, and it's just a coincidence that they happen to agree with us on all these
Exactly.
issues.
So that's what I'm worried about under Labour, is if they come in, I suspect they're going to pass all of these things. They're going to depoliticise vast amounts of public policy. So essentially, the only things you can argue about are tax and spending, which they're already trying to remove and put into the OBRs thing. So all of our political debates will become essentially irrelevant because they are run by supposedly independent public bodies, which are filled with basically Labour cronies, or not just Labour cronies, but sort of that kind of mainstream centrist viewpoint that I'm sure many in that centrist viewpoint in the Conservative Party, people like Theresa May, George Osborne would also agree with.
Yeah, but the other thing to be worth pointing out there is that, I mean, as Evan pointed out to you, you did say when the Conservatives lose. So, I mean, if we're agreeing that it's highly likely that the Conservatives are going to lose, and I think we're all agree that they're extremely likely next year to get turfed out, no matter what they do in the next 9 months or however long it is. It seems to me that on the right, what we should be focusing on is trying to make sure that that loss is processed in the right way rather than trying to avert it. And so, for example, were we to have a situation in which Labour is perceived to overperform and Labour is perceived to have done extremely well and is perceived to be extremely popular, then people like David Gauke, people like Rory Stewart will say, you see, the Conservative Party was too far right. We need to, hug towards the centre. They've even got a book coming out. I think they've co-authored it. David Gauke and Rory Stewart. I can't wait to read it. It's called something like Reinvigorating Centrist Politics or something like that. And
it'll pair well with Liz Truss's.
Well, and Daniel Hannan reviewed it positively in the Telegraph as well, which is concerning to me, but at any rate. The second thing I would say is that, however, if we were to have a situation in which Labour won, but in lots of swing marginals across the country, Reform were, say, like taking 15% off the Conservative vote and therefore enabling Labour to win, I think it would be very difficult for the Conservative Party, if the electoral map looked like that on the next morning, Reform denying Conservative victories in key marginals, it would be very difficult for the Conservative Party, for people like David Gauke and for people like Rory Stewart to argue that the Conservatives were insufficiently conservative. Insufficiently centrist.
I wonder what you think about this, Steve. I saw Suella's little quote, "Rivers of blood, multiculturalism has failed" speech yesterday, and I thought maybe, perhaps optimistically and naively, this might actually be some, kind of an indication of Suella and some other people inside of the Tories kind of seeing which way the wind is blowing, that they're going to get bounced out and then they're going to have to basically like revivify, and saying like, okay, we're actually going to pivot here and we're going to take a little bit of a harder stance on this key issue of multiculturalism and migration in advance to basically preempt this kind of return to like, I don't know, sensible centrist conservative politics. What do you think? What did you make of that speech?
I think there's two lines of argument that I'm kind of torn between. The first is what you're saying there. I think Suella is fairly sound on these issues. I think she is lining up for a leadership bid. I think it's highly likely that after she loses, it will be someone like Suella or Kemi or someone like that, I think, will win. I think it's very likely that someone like that will take the leadership of the Conservative Party.
But particularly if sorry to interrupt, but again, particularly this is why I think it's so important that the loss, when it happens, is processed in the right way, and that requires reform. I think doing quite well and shaving off Conservative votes in those key marginals. Yeah,
possibly. I think it'll be pretty obvious for the Conservative membership.
Certainly, but as you know, the Parliamentary Conservative Party needs to whittle down candidates before putting them to the Conservative membership.
Absolutely, and I think that there is enough kind of Conservative, with a small c MPs that will enable a Conservative candidate to come into the last two. But anyway, but the second kind of thing that I always have in the back of my mind when I hear a speech like Suella's is, who's been in charge for the last 13 years? And also, how many speeches have I heard like this before? Even Cameron made speeches which were fairly similar.
We made the exact same speech. I mean, Cameron said in 2011, I think it was, that multiculturalism has failed. The sainted Angela Merkel made the same speech in 2010 in Germany.
I just think, how many times can we be fooled into thinking that these people are going to do anything? I mean, Suella Braverman is the Home Secretary. She is the woman who is in charge of. Right, okay, let's put illegal immigration to one side, because, okay, well, you could blame the Human Rights Act and the UN Refugee Convention and Macron and blah. Ultimately, actually is her responsibility and she should take the authority for that. But let's put that to one side. Legal immigration. You could stop legal immigration tomorrow. Why doesn't she? Why doesn't the Cabinet? So she makes these speeches.
Just turn the website off. Turn the application portal off.
Or just repeal what Boris Johnson did by liberalising immigration laws and making the criteria so low that practically anyone.
There are so many policy options that she has, policy levers. And I've done stories on this before where civil servants, literally we've published internal guidance in various departments, including the Home Office, laying out the levers, the policy levers that ministers have to reduce legal migration, but they don't do it. And why don't they do it? And the fact that she's made this speech, we all think, oh, fantastic, but look at the outcomes. I think that's where you've got to focus on. Look at what's actually happened. Look at the record, particularly under Suella Braverman. I'm sorry to say this, but we have had record immigration under her, both legal and illegal.
It's like the right has been so starved of red meat over the last 13 years that a little morsel is sort of hung out for us, and we just start getting incredibly excited.
That's exactly it. And I just think you have to kind of have a more objective and sort of cool opinion of this speech and think, okay, well, she's saying all the right things. When are they actually going to start delivering?
Yes.
Now, this might seem like a bit of an odd pivot, but we've been talking a lot about kind of the deep state or the blob or whatever you want to call it, right? The cathedral. What did you make of the Russell Brand situation and how basically he was able to, I'm no comment at all on Brand's behavior, whether he's guilty or not, but that the kind of the media infrastructure and the right of center alternative media was able to kind of frame this as like kind of a deep state or blob attack on Brand for being a truth teller. What do you make of that?
If I'm being completely honest, I'm going to say something that's probably quite unpopular with your viewers. I think that the investigation into Brand was not an establishment hit job. I think that this was journalists working on a story for many years, trying to make sure that every part of the story was correct. They had to fact check it, they had to source it. Now you can criticise that reporting, you can say it was incomplete, you can say that aspects of it were wrong, you can say that the allegations were historic and whatever. Maybe there are some legitimate criticisms of the reporting, like why didn't some of the women come forward and put their name to the allegations, for example. However, this idea that this was some sort of attempt by various establishment figures to take down someone who they think is some kind of threat to them because of his YouTube videos on COVID, I think is unlikely.
Yeah,
that's just my view. And that's me saying that as a journalist who works on the investigative stories. I don't think that, I've never been told by some sort of figure, some conservative guy, you must go, now it's time to go after the civil service, and now you must do this. No, I just don't think that happens. I'm sorry, that's me being kind of mainstream media. I'm probably being signed up by Soros or someone anyway, but that's just my view. And I think the other thing, but the other thing I'll say about Brand is that Caroline Dinenage, she should never have written that letter to TikTok and Rumble. So this is the Conservative MP. I think that was, if you want to look for kind of establishment stitch-ups, you can look at there. Mm-hmm. That is the sort of...
what happened there, sorry?
So this is the chairwoman of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee in Parliament, sent a letter to Rumble and to TikTok and to various other social media companies basically saying, you need to remove Russell Brand's...
videos, content.
Ability to, not necessarily content, but his ability to make money. So they said, is he making money? How much money is he making?
Wow.
Are you aware of these allegations, etc.? So putting huge pressure on these social media sites to demonetize Brand. And I think that's wrong because he hasn't been charged. There are no kind of, I know the police are investigating this, but, we have that innocent before, proven guilty kind of...
that old thing.
That old thing. So I don't think the investigation by the Sunday Times or by Channel 4 was some grand conspiracy by the establishment to take down this guy on the internet. But I do think that, if you want to look for examples of the establishment intervening in this case, it's very clear that Caroline Dinenage, Conservative MP, should never have done that.
And that's
in the
interesting.
position.
I didn't know that she's a Conservative MP as well, and she was completely
really woke. She's
not
really
caring in the least about this sort of thing.
Rumble is a Canadian company, I believe.
Yeah.
So
it faces being shut down in Britain. Its operations. Yeah, I forget the exact details, so just don't. But it's it's definitely true. They face losing their ability to operate in the UK. So.
And with it, lots of content creators who their ability to make money because they've been barred from YouTube, they've been barred from other places, and all that sort of thing.
Well, Rumble is the place, I suppose, for free speech. It's like the free speech alternative to YouTube, right? So you have kind of more controversial people like Brand who are going on there, and lots of advertising companies have now pulled their ads from Rumble, which I thought was funny because you had the kind of these mainstream advertisers, some really big kind of name companies. I was thinking, how did you advertise already on Rumble? I couldn't believe that you already did that. I was quite surprised. Almost encouraging that they were already doing that. But obviously they pulled out now.
Do you think we might see? So it's interesting. So you mentioned this woman, this Conservative MP, who, as you say, is incredibly woke. On the I don't know how often you interact with MPs, how much of the Conservative Party, the parliamentary party, to your mind, how much of those people are sort of irredeemably woke on all sorts of issues, and they're going to have to be they're going to have to be purged from the party in the same way that a lot of the extreme Remainers were purged by Boris Johnson. I think 25 or so of them were just completely thrown out of the party because they were blocking Brexit and all the rest of it. In order to purify the Conservative Party, so to speak, if such a thing can be done, how many people would have to be sent marching orders?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know them all. I can't tell you. I could say that there is, a large rump of them.
Sounds pretty in-depth.
I think, I know some good ones.
Few.
There are some good ones as well.
But because that seems to me that those sorts of recriminations are going to happen after they lose in 2024.
I think basically, if you come at this from a Conservative perspective, the only way to pass those significant reforms we were talking about earlier is for those people to leave the Conservative Party and to go to the Lib Dems, go to Labour, which, Theresa May's home is far more, I'd say, suited to her in somewhere like Labour or the Lib Dems. I think that's far more closer to her politics than the Conservative Party. She's not Conservative. I just don't see her being a Conservative figure in basically any way.
No.
Speaking of a large Conservative political party that needs a good cleaning, the American Republicans. Now, last time you were here, we talked about CPAC. You had just come back from seeing Trump and DeSantis. And, I made the prediction that DeSantis wouldn't even run, which I was wrong about. He did run. It's looking like he probably shouldn't have. What do you make of the current state of America, having just been in Canada and America and being fairly tuned in? What do you think about the race as it's kind of developing over there?
What do I think about that? I think DeSantis has, unfortunately, as you say, I think he's lost the primaries. I think, if you look at any opinion poll, unfortunately, he's kind of really dropped to a significant level. Vivek Ramaswamy has done very well. Obviously, I think Trump is. I think it's pretty obvious he's going to get the nomination. I think that it's an unfortunate state of affairs. I think we talked about this before, where I think someone like Trump, in many ways, he's an interesting and good figure on the right. He's kind of willing to push very controversial topics, and I think he got some things done when he was president. But is he the most effective person to deliver on conservative policies? I don't think so. I think he's narcissistic. I think he focuses. I think he focuses far too much on the drama around his life, rather than the more ideological and political perspectives. And there's so many issues facing America today. I think it's a huge shame that someone who could be really, really effective at tackling these massive problems in America has these huge character flaws. And I think, for the future of conservatism in America, which is such an important country, where, all around the world, when you look at conservatives, we're looking to America for kind of guidance and a sort of vision. I just think, this is just my view, I just think it's a little bit depressing that Trump is almost certainly going to win the primaries, and I think he'll lose against Biden if Biden runs. But that's just my instinct.
It's interesting though, Stephen, because there was so part of DeSantis' case for the nomination has been, I am Trump in terms of all the policy content, but without the baggage, without the perhaps not, without the narcissism. I can sort of be an effective, quiet Trump rather than a noisy, dramatic Trump. That's been his point. But that and part of his point off the back of that is that I am more likely to beat Biden than Trump is. But recently, a Washington Post poll came out in which Trump was 10 points ahead of Biden.
I think you've got to be really suspicious of it. This is just me being honest. I know I think you've got to be really suspicious of polls at this far out. And
you think they're trying to bolster Trump?
I don't want to be conspiratorial, but if you wanted to win the election and you're a Democrat and you think
you want to run against Trump,
and you want to run against Trump, the best thing to do now is to put polls out saying that Trump is going to beat Biden, because that will make people think, okay, brilliant, we've got a shot here. I don't actually think that that's what's happened, by the way. I just think that that's a useful political strategy, and I think people who want to big up these polls, there's definitely a motivation behind that. And I know you're saying, is DeSantis the kind of competent version of Trump, and you're sort of saying he's not. I think that the problem DeSantis has had is he has been painted as some kind of lefty Republican, some sort of like normie Republican, like sort of George Bush type. When I don't think that is accurate. I mean, if you look at his record in Florida, I don't think that is accurate. But unfortunately, he's hired some poor choices of kind of consultants. I think he's surrounded himself with poor advisors, and I think the Trump team have been very effective at being able to paint him as this kind of mainstream rhino Republican.
Again, I mean, I'm a registered Florida Republican. I'm a big fan of Governor DeSantis, a huge one. But I do agree that I thought his best sort of trait over Trump was being able to pick these great teams, and his election team has been god-awful. The reason I bring up America, though, is two reasons. The first is, I don't know if you saw the Tucker Carlson interview with Trump.
Yes,
where he asks Trump 2 times, do you think that this kind of deep state cabal, whatever you want to call it, will kill you? Which Trump's like, people are passionate, and he just kind of brushes it off. But I thought it was very interesting that question would even get asked. And I think it's very...
I do think, to be honest, I think that's slightly hyperbolic.
I agree, but just the fact that even in a slightly hyperbolic way, I don't think anybody would ever ask a presidential nominee, even in 2016, nobody would have asked anybody that. So it just goes to show you how kind of aware people are, and maybe the center, maybe people to the right of the center are of this kind of blob-like apparatus, which just coming out of Whitehall is seeping into everything.
I think the conservatives in America have been radicalized to a big extent because of the way the Democrats have been treating certain political candidates like Trump, in terms of all of the legal issues that he's facing, and also the legal issues that, the January 6th rioters, some of those are facing very, very long prison sentences for doing things that shouldn't really merit those long sentences. And when you look at the hypocrisy of how judges might treat BLM protesters who did similar things or worse things, and they're getting far lighter sentences. I can understand why so many conservatives in America feel completely radicalized by this. And I think it's worth looking into. You can go back all the way to the Civil Rights Act 1964, where this, in America, Christopher Caldwell's written a fantastic book about this, Age of Entitlement.
Great book.
Where he kind of traces the origins of why American politics is so extreme at the moment and why the American right is so radicalized. And I think part of that is because for many, many years, it has been ingrained within a sort of alternative constitution in America that basically white men, again, as I was saying earlier, are almost at a disadvantage in law to minority groups. And I think that that is basically the essence of we are seeing the outcome of that kind of legal revolution in America that happened in the 60s and was ingrained in the 70s and even through Ronald Reagan's reforms as well. So I think everyone should read that book and if they want to understand why the American right have become so radicalized, I think that's a really good place to start.
And when you add to that another act of the 1965 Immigration Act in America, in which JFK was dead by that point, but Robert F. Kennedy promised at the time, assured people at the time that this wouldn't lead to any really significant demographic transformations in American life. Like when you have a people that is adamantly in favor of lowering migration numbers, and yet migration numbers continue to tick up. We've seen that in the US over the last 50 years. We've seen it in Britain over the last 20 years
but
or so.
Then Reagan cemented it into law in the
Yeah.
80s. And he passed this huge act which basically said we're going to try and tackle immigration by putting loads of funding into new border guards and border patrols, etc., which completely failed. And then he had the other part of the act which basically said we're going to give amnesty.
There's an amnesty,
So, yeah.
Follow-up question to this would be, what do you make of the rise of Vivek? I think it's very interesting comparing and contrasting Rishi and Vivek. And I think it's fascinating that Swami has gone from like 1% in the polls to now I've seen polls of him in like 15%. And that's with, against Trump and DeSantis as well. I think he's got much farther to go as the fields kind of get whittled down here. He's catapulted into this kind of like this very prominent position within the party, basically echoing what I would say was my kind of joking solution to sorting out the civil service in the UK of just, we're going to shut down the Department of Education. We're going to shut these things down. This is something that's very popular, actually, with American conservative voters.
I think he's a very effective communicator, and I think that there's a lot to learn from how he has run his campaign. I think he comes across very authentic. He comes across very down to earth. But my actual view of him is, I think, to be honest, I think he's like a complete faker. I think that if you look at what he wrote about Trump, fairly recently, he was very critical. He says things that he disagreed with just like a year ago. I think he's all about. I think there's something deeper going on with his campaign. He wanted to try and shut down DeSantis. I think he's done a very effective job of that. But I think at the same time, the way he's campaigned has been extraordinary. And I think that someone like DeSantis can actually learn from Vivek and say, he's a great debater. He took control of those debates. The way that he's run his campaign online is very, very effective. And just by responding and being fairly sort of like he uses his phone and he does these kind of selfie videos and he just responds to criticism on Twitter. And I think that's a really good way of doing it, rather than DeSantis, who's kind of quite wooden and sort of comes across very corporate.
Everything's pre-prepared.
But one thing that Vivek has done extremely effectively, and this is something which does get you popular with Republicans, is he goes into the lion's den. I mean, he will do interviews with MSNBC, he will do interviews with CNN, he will do interviews with all sorts of hostile media, and he will perform well in those. There was a very viral one which I think did a lot for his poll numbers, a big boost in his poll numbers, when he was at odds with Don Lemon on CNN over whether
Don Lemon's career.
Yeah,
that was it.
Whether America is systemically racist. People actually want to see Republicans go into these venues. I mean, part of DeSantis' stardom during the COVID was precisely that he would shut down questions from lockdown-friendly media outlets and would completely decimate them. That makes you incredibly popular. I also think DeSantis, this is a final point I'll make, I think he's struggled. He talks a lot about Florida, but he's struggled to translate what his Florida successes would look like at a national level. He struggled to communicate that. He's a little bit too backward-looking in terms of, we did this in Florida. In Florida, we did this. The woke virus. He's very repetitive and wooden. And he's not really offering people a. I think he does have a blueprint for what he wants to do with the United States, were he to become president, but he's not being very effective at communicating it.
Well, I think again, Vivek reminds me in a way of Suella Braverman, actually, because again, she's making all the right statements, she's saying all the right things, but do I actually trust this person to deliver? I don't know. I think Vivek. This is just my view. I just think Vivek. You have to be very, very cautious about him. I think for someone to supposedly change their mind on so many of these different issues that he's talking about now in such a short period of time, says to me this guy is a is basically a snake oil salesman.
Yeah.
And I think the direction of American politics for people like Vivek, people like Trump, is slightly depressing. And also, obviously, how Biden is a complete disaster, and how the Democrats are treating their political opponents through using the courts. The whole thing is just talk about despair in Britain. I mean, gosh, I'm glad we're not America.
I also didn't. Yeah, that's true. I also didn't particularly like it when Vivek was asked about immigration, and he said, "We need more people like my parents coming to this country." And let me try and explain why I didn't like that. It seems to me that there are two ways you can conceive of national belonging. You can conceive national belonging as having a kind of an ancestral connection to the place, it underpinned by a shared history and a shared culture, which is recognizably yours, because you see your ancestors reflected in whatever it is, like this achievement, that achievement. Gosh, you look at your society and you feel, and I think this is true for most people, you feel an emotional sense of identification with it. And then there are people like Vivek, and you're right, he is very smart. But the problem is that for most people, national belonging is not an intellectual affair. It's an emotional one. Like very few people love Britain because they know what the common law is. Like it's just people have a vague sense of, gosh, I like this place. This is I see my ancestors and achievements reflected all around me. There's that instinctive sense, but very few people intellectualize that. And Vivek seems to me to have far too much faith in the ability of new arrivals to intellectualize their identification with America.
I don't know if I fully 100% agree with that. I think that is, and I don't mean this in an insulting way, I think that is kind of a very European way of looking at it. Whereas, again, I'm not disagreeing. I think that's totally fine to say about a country like Britain. But I think America, it's slightly different. I mean, I'm a naturalized American, right? Sure. And America is kind of a nation of immigrants, and they do want you to kind of come there and contribute. I think that is more part of their general. The general culture of America, they actually do want people like Vivek's parents. Most people would agree with that.
That nation of immigrants line is not, like, that nation of immigrants line is a JFK line, and it comes from the 1960s, when there was this huge change in terms of what America is about, and there was this sort of retrospective myth-making in America that the Statue of Liberty has always been there to signal the fact, give me your wretched, give me your weak, your poor, we'll bring them in, all this sort of thing. This language of American universalism is in fact a very recent phenomenon. If you'd asked practically any of the presidents of America leading up to JFK whether you think that America is fundamentally an extension of Europe, they would have said absolutely it's an extension of Europe. This is like the language you're talking about, the language of universalism, has only really been around for the last 50 years.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that either. I think though that there's been such a fundamental shift in American culture that people are pretty happy left and right to say people like Vivek's parents should come here, and that has kind of become the predominant position, which it is very different than most European countries. Again, too, like I'm literally a legal immigrant to America.
Sure.
And I think most people there are pretty happy when somebody wants to come and contribute. But that's really neither here nor there. It's just a very interesting way that America and European countries differ on the immigration issue.
But you've got to look at the demographics of America and the huge shift you've had since the 1960s. America was essentially a massively majority white country until very, very recently. And if you look at the issues on the southern border now, where you've got literally millions of people coming in under Joe Biden from all
they're
of these...
illegal immigrants.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's not what Vivek's talking about.
Yeah, he's talking about legal immigration, in fairness. But I want to make it super clear, I'm not against having incredibly enterprising people. If I were an American, I'm not against having incredibly enterprising people like Vivek's parents come in. But I just think there's a limit to how easily you can encourage new arrivals, whether legal or illegal, to identify with America just because you give them a sheet of, well, yeah, look, here are our values, and if you tick all these boxes of our synthetic values, then you're one of us. I don't think that. I think for most people, as I said, national belonging isn't an intellectual affair, and therefore there's a limit to how successful that form of civic nationalism, as opposed to what I would call ancestral nationalism. I think there's a limit to how effective that can be.
I agree. I think it's just a difference in that, like, anybody can become an American, but like not anybody can become English, for example. Like I can't become English. It's a minute point. Maybe a slightly more depressing country, though, than even the state of America would be the state of Canada, Back to the Commonwealth, where you just did this excellent documentary.
Yeah, it's very good.
Where I, in Vancouver, where I went to university, just across the water in Victoria. What did you make of the state of my my country? I think
that anyone who wants to know my thoughts on it should go and watch the documentary. Right. I think that's what I'd say. I think there are huge issues in Canada, even worse than America, even worse than in Britain.
4.5 million views or so, isn't it? At this
That's
point?
right.
It's done incredibly well.
4.5 million. So go and watch the film, and they can find out exactly what's going on.
Wonderful.
fair
Well,
enough.
and we'll finish on a plug like that. Stephen, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming back as our second guest. It's been a privilege as ever. Evan, thank you as well. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.